everyone, I'm Ishika.
And I'm Akshay.
The thing about wildlife is anyone can fall in love with it through science, photography, literature, or innocent observation. Sharing this love with us today, we have with us Veena Kapoor from the Nature Conservation Foundation. Hi again, thanks for staying tuned, and welcome back to part 2, where we switch gears into some snazzy nature and conservation education that Veena has been doing for the last few years. So let's talk a little bit about environmental education. How did you decide to get into this? And you're pretty knee deep in it now. So let's switch gears there and talk about what that means, because environmental education in itself is quite a large chunk to chew off, considering the population of the country and how lacking it is at the moment. So yeah, so why don't we start with you telling us how you got into this?
Yeah, so when I think about it a little bit, I think it's also a little bit to do with my own personal journey, right? And I remember being extremely angry when I first learned about the Fig and Fig Wasp Association. And I think I must have been 21 or 22 at that point of time. And I was like, why didn't I learn about this in school? I mean, I would have just enjoyed biology so much more. And when I started reading, ecology textbooks and started engaging with what ecology is, and I'm like, there's so much potential to introduce so much of this into our school textbooks, right? And this, so I remember being extremely angry that we didn't do any of this in school. Instead, we were sitting and drawing, the digestive system of a cockroach, which may be important, great, but there's so much more exciting natural history information we could have been engaged with in school. So there's a little bit in terms of why, for me, I'm not calling it environmental education, because I think environmental education means a little different from, I'd like to say what I'm doing is more nature education as opposed to environmental education, because I don't bring in things like the pollution aspects or the climate change aspects into the kind of work that I do currently. So I call the work that I do nature education more, or nature learning, right? Because education is also a little bit of a loaded term. At least, and that's my journey in which, I used to call it education, but then I realized as I'm reading and engaging with it more, it's a bit loaded. So it started a little bit with, like I told you, when I started documenting spiders, I started, doing a lot of talks and walks for people, for the general public and for students. And I could see how just a small little intervention really helps people to explore their surroundings a little bit more. People would write or, call me and say, I'm seeing so many more spiders and I'm really enjoying going for walks now because I'm seeing a lot of things. And so small things like that really get you to think, saying that, okay, we need to kind of, use the fact that I have this knowledge now because somebody else opened up a whole new world for me. How can I best now pass on that knowledge and that kind of experience to other people? And I think we have to keep asking ourselves to do that a little bit more, right? And I think it's an important part of our, what the conservation community should do. So in Valpare as well, while I was doing some of my spider research work, for a little while I also went into a school space there. And we tried, because there were some interns who came at one point, and we were just having a conversation saying, hey, why don't we work with the school over there in one of the schools in Valpare? And we wrote a short play on the human elephant conflict in Valpare at that point in time. And we said, can we do a play with the school kids, which they would then, showcase to their parents and to the tea estate managers. And so for some time, so we wrote the script, but we got the students over there to make their own costumes. And so the script was a little bit about a baby elephant getting lost, and how it's because people were throwing firecrackers, and how it was reunited with its family and things like that. So it was a kiddie kind of a script, but it did make a bit of an impact on the tea estate company people, as well as the tea pickers themselves, because we also did the play in Tamil and English. And so I had a little bit of experience in terms of conservation education in that kind of field. Whenever I got an opportunity, I would do these talks and take people out on nature walks. So there was a kind of a thread I was seeing throughout my career where I was still engaged or very passionate about nature education as such. And so when I came back to Bangalore after Cambridge, my Cambridge stint, I had an opportunity to work with Suhail, who was then, heading the education and public engagement program of Nature Conservation Foundation. It was a fairly new program that was set up. As part of this, we were being supported by the Wipro, what was then called the Wipro Applying Taught in Schools program. So Wipro was very interested in supporting individuals and organizations who are working in the education field and across different facets of education, especially school education. So Suhail and I would often meet people doing such fascinating work in the field of education, right? In the field of, how do you use theater to communicate certain things like, say, democracy within a school system? Or, how do you get students to engage more collaboratively by using sport? And a lot of these individuals and organizations were working in extremely challenging areas and spaces. And so we would constantly, have conversations with them as part of the partners meets, which would happen. And they would, often use a lot of our material. At that point of time, as a program, we were creating a lot of content on nature and, creating a lot of material on nature. And so they were using a lot of our material, but they would also ask us often to come and can we do some nature education programs in their areas, or they would ask us for suggestions on how they can include elements of nature within this. And so as part of this, the idea started developing, with Suhail and me, saying that, okay, we know that environmental sciences is a compulsory subject now in Indian schools, especially in the primary sections. But looking at the textbooks, we saw how devoid of, a nature element these textbooks were. And so we kind of put together an idea and proposal saying that, can we start thinking of how we can include what we were calling more kind of relevant nature learning material that can be weaved into the environmental sciences textbooks across different classes. So can we make it more age appropriate? Can we make it more locally contextual and also include elements of culture in it? And also it has to be very specific to that particular area in school, right? Because we also realized that different schools have different access to outdoor spaces. How do we kind of correct for that? We can't just tell people go outdoors and observe this when they don't have any outdoors to go to, right? So how do you include a nature element learning as part of that? A lot of government schools, don't have those kind of spaces, or the opportunities. Teachers don't have the time to take children out. So we put together what, an idea in terms of, can we work with teachers? Because we also realized that as a conservation community, we were doing a lot of outreach to students and to younger kids outside of the school hours, taking them on nature walks, exposing them to things, doing talks for them. And these were great and these should continue. But is it possible to have a much more sustainable kind of sustained interaction with these, with school spaces, and introduce in small doses a more nature element into the environmental sciences subject? And so, of course, the challenges were that education being in the concurrent list, like each state, approached the way the content and textbooks very differently. So, even within a city like Bangalore, different schools would be following different textbooks. And while the larger kind of curriculum was followed based on what NCERT was telling them to follow, the content and the distillation of it was so different across different schools, right? So government schools would follow the Karnataka state government textbooks. Private schools would have their own textbooks which they would follow, and There was no continuity in lessons, nothing. So we then said, okay, here are these chapters. We also realized that there was a common thread, okay, which was kind of being followed across these different textbooks. It had all the environmental sciences chapters had a very human-centric way of looking at the environment. So it was often things like, what do plants give us? You know, what do these animals give us? Um, what do we get from plants? You know, that very human-centric kind of thing. So we wanted to kind of see if we can shift the perspective of how this is approached and taught to getting students and teachers to get them to think a little bit about how humans are part of the larger ecosystem and not central to the larger ecosystem. But how do you then sensitively kind of approach this topic? So while that was our main focus, we were also thinking that each chapter needs to be kind of, approached in a particular way. So just to give you an example, there is a chapter on hygiene, which is in an environmental science textbook. And they show how children need to keep themselves clean, right? So initially we said, oh, this is not a chapter we can work with. There's no nature element in it. But then, after we suddenly had a light bulb moment and said, oh, okay, here's a chance for us to tell students and teachers, how do animals and insects keep themselves clean? And so to introduce that kind of element into their hygiene chapter. And for us, the reason why I brought up this example was that this was also, we found a light bulb moment for the teacher we were engaging with at that point of time to introduce this, right? And so when she saw how we took a chapter on hygiene and put in a nature element into it, she started looking at the textbook and saying, oh my gosh, I can now see how I can introduce nature in all the chapters, including things like festivals, right? There's a chapter on festivals. And so for us, that was very heartening to see that the teacher herself started seeing potential in some of these interventions. So in terms of the education, nature education work that we're doing now, we don't often work directly with students, but what we're trying to do is work with teachers in these schools to co-create with them what we're calling nature learning modules. And then so we do classroom observations to see how they approach a particular chapter. Then we ask them and discuss with them saying, okay, can you add these other nature elements as part of your textbook? But sorry, Ishika, I went a little bit off track to tell you about the kind of the work that we're doing. But in terms of the education element itself, like I said, going back to our interactions and conversations with people in the education field itself was very important learning for someone like me, because I realized that there's a whole discipline that we weren't engaging with. And here is a discipline which is so old and has a rich kind of it's a discipline that has very theoretical kind of knowledge, right, which has been built up, and a discipline that has actually practically used the theory into learning spaces, and it's a discipline that is rich in research and practice. And I kept thinking, why are we as a conservation community not engaged more with the discipline of education? So we say we're doing conservation education, but it's often we who are trained in ecology, wildlife sciences, who's doing that education work. And when you start kind of engaging with literature on education and what people have written, there's so much of learning we can take into a lot of our conservation education work and our nature education work that we do, because we don't think about how important it is to look at what age group we are targeting, for example. And so, education has looked at child development theory and psychology to see at what age group what needs to be emphasized and what tools need to be used for that age group for them to be engaged in a particular subject, right? And even kind of education system like a Montessori education system actually has a lot of parallels that we can draw from and learn from in our conservation education work. And so some of us actually started engaging with the education literature, and talking to people in the education sector itself to understand what aspects we can use in our nature education thing. So we're still just scratching the surface. We are still also trialing out a lot of these things and still trying to understand the space. But we are getting there, and we're hoping to kind of talk about this much more within our conservation community itself, to be able to train ourselves in some of these methods, and reading and things like that. And so hopefully in a few months time, a bunch of us have also spoken, we'll be able to have like a workshop where we can share some of our learnings, so far with the larger conservation community itself.
I think what's very important from what you've said is also kind of cycling back to what you mentioned earlier about research being a very individualistic pursuit. And when many researchers decide to get into some kind of nature education or environmental education, there's kind of an assumption that, oh, I'm such an expert in this field. I mean, of course, I can, take this and do outreach and, have this discourse. But education, like you said, has its own pedagogy, has been around for hundreds of years, and there is a lot we don't know. And this is probably one of the larger issues with a lot of interdisciplinary work, where you just assume you can do everything on your own without realizing that there's each discipline is so well established and in depth and nuanced in itself, and one person may not be able to do it all at once.
And shouldn't do it as well. Shouldn't
Yeah.
do it as well. Yeah. You
Right.
have to be able to be open to collaborating with people and listening to other people's experiences as well.
Right. So that actually, it brings me to also ask you, I've been working a little bit with nature education for a little over a year now, and I can already see that, it's a mammothous task. There's so much to be done because, like you said, putting all the NGOs together who have decided to dabble with nature education in some form or the other, we've still only scratched the surface. And there are so many different options and ways in which to enter this field. In what way do you approach nature education? And many NGOs do it differently. Even a simple question of whether you want to spend several years with a small cluster of schools and teachers, really helping them build sustainable education for that smaller group of people, or do you spend smaller amounts of time with many more schools and many more teachers and students? What is more effective? So where do you stand when it comes to these things? Where do you think is the right place for an NGO to step in?
Again, it depends, Ishika, on the capacity that you have at that point of time. So I've been fortunate to have 3 years of funding for this work. And I've also been fortunate to have a budget which allows to bring other people into the work as well, right? And so I budgeted for a person who has, experience in the education field. So one of my team members is a person who, Roshni, who has done her counseling, master's in counseling from TIS, but she has almost 7-8 years of experience of teaching as a teacher itself in an alternate school in Bangalore. But she comes with a very rich experience of, understanding what it is to be a teacher and also being in the education field. I got a little bit of an injection of funds to also bring in a person who is an illustrator and a person who also has experience in outreach. So I needed a person who would then understand what it is to design a particular module, right? Which is effective for a teacher as well as for children. So it really depends on the kind of funding that you have, what kind of interventions you can do, because it would then, determine who you can bring on board as well, right? And for us, that's our biggest challenge, right, in this field, to be able to raise money for someone's salary. But that's so important. So I've been fortunate to be able to have like a small group of people with very diverse skill sets to make this project what it is right now. But I kind of have chosen the path of the former, where we prefer to work with a small group of schools for now, and intensively work with them. So we've intentionally chosen a few schools in and around Bangalore, and it's a mixture of government schools and private schools, because it's an initial kind of work. We think we have a lot to learn and understand, and we thought that having a geographical proximity to be able to go to these schools often was important. So we and our engagement with the schools, we've already always told them it's not going to be one-off. We work with them through the school year. So these teachers have actually now seen us for a year and a half. Right, so they know that we are serious about our collaboration with them, our interventions with them. It also allows us for trialing and testing. So it's not enough that we kind of sit here and plan and design our modules. We also need to see whether it's working in a classroom like situation. Is the teacher able to translate what we're giving to her or him, to the students? Is it age appropriate? And it may work in one school setup, it may not work in another school setup, depending on how the teacher is able to transact it. So what is happening is that we approach each school with a very bespoke model almost. So it's catered for that particular school, because it, again, like I told you earlier, depends on the kind of outdoor space and access they have. Are the teachers enthused to even take the children out? Or if the teachers enthused but the school management is not enthused because of safety reasons, then what do you do in a situation like that? So we try not to give very kind of planned out model and tell them, okay, do this now in your classroom. We try and understand what is also possible for the teacher herself or himself to be able to do in that particular space. And be empathetic to the fact that teachers are extremely kind of overworked, overburdened, and stressed, right? Even though a school is open to a lot of these interventions, and especially because we're working with the younger kids, we feel that the pressure of exams is not as much. There is still evaluation which they have to think of, even in the best of schools. So the teachers constantly having to come back to a traditional evaluation methods. So even if they want to introduce a lot of these nature learning elements, and they come back and tell us about how they see children themselves are kind of opening up and being more creative just with these small little interventions, because they're seeing that they are engaging with the subject more, it's no longer boring. They still say, but we still have to, give them tests. And the tests go back into a traditional kind of thing. So we're chipping away slowly at that, because the hope is that these schools that we work with, in the long run, look at nature learning as part of their school ethos, just like they would sports or art or painting. We want these schools to also look at nature learning as part of the ethos of the school. And we think that's the only way it will be sustainable. So our model right now is very much fewer schools and deeper engagement. But what we're trying to do is, early on in the work, we have created what we're calling a nature learning framework. And I think I've shared this with you as well. And this is something that we're going to put out for anyone to use. And based on the principles of education theory and practice and our own experience in terms of what we are seeing works or not, we are kind of creating what we're calling a framework, nature learning framework for different age groups. And so for this particular age group, what should be our objectives for nature learning, and what are the tools that can be used, right? And this is a working model, but it informs the way we approach our nature learning work as well in the different schools. But we're hoping that this will become a framework for other people who are interested to get into nature education as well in the school system, which they can use. Or even for people who are taking kids on nature walks, for example, can they use this framework to say, okay, this is the age group of kids I'm targeting, or what should be my kind of goals for this age group, and what kind of tools are best suited for this particular age group. And so all that we are producing and testing and trialing out will be open source soon. We have a little website that we are creating now. So everything will start being put up on that. And so people can start using those templates and make it more, tweak it a little bit for their own context as well. And we're trying to make it as easy to use and to understand and to be able to use in their own school kind of thing. So even a step-by-step instruction kind of sheets are what we are kind of trying to put together now. And the hope is that we'll start also offering more workshops to people who are interested in getting into this space, whether it's parents, whether it's the conservation community, or whether just people who want to volunteer for their time to introduce people to nature.
Yeah, as I sit here, I mean, I have no experience in this field. I know Ishika is working in that, and you have a long history of experience there. So it's fascinating to listen to how, for me, my exposure to education is through school, and the other fascination for nature I have is through research. So the marrying of the two and how they don't map on to the way science, like physics, biology, and chemistry map on, which is so different, and that is fascinating to hear. So yeah, thank you. I'm I'm an active listener here. But that just reminds me of this one interesting thing that you mentioned sometime back, and I think that's a thread that you talk about, which is how most traditional environment education focuses on utility, right? How nature and environment can be useful to us, and a lot of what you spoke about is about breaking that stereotype and making people look at things differently, both teachers and their students. So this I just want to know, which it would be interesting for our listeners to know what your personal opinion about this is, which is the ethics of it, right? So we are trying to communicate the love and curiosity for nature that we have as people who have dabbled in nature in whatever way, and we are in some sense changing people's minds, one could say that, or behaviors. So what's your position on that? Do you think that's a reasonable way to put it or not?
I would also again urge all of us to think about a little bit about the kind of messaging that we're putting out to the world, and who is our messaging being targeted towards. So I think some of us in this field very, very firm, kind of very passionately believe that young children should not be kind of burdened with the whole climate change, deforestation, global warming kind of discourse, because it's I think irresponsible to put that kind of burden on such young children's heads. Two is that it's not their fault, right, in terms of what's happening with the world today, and also they're too young to have an agency to be able to make a change, even if they feel about it. And so I've had colleagues telling me about how their very young kids have been taught in school about how Bangalore is going to be unlivable in 5-6 years, or about how climate change and global warming is completely kind of killing the earth and world. And so I'm sure the teacher was well intentioned, but this kid has come back crying to the parent saying, is that true? And a lot of people are now talking about climate grief as well, right? How do you kind of, you're constantly grieving for the state of the climate. So I think before we put out our messaging, I think we really need to be a little careful about what age group are we targeting, right? So, and we really think that for young kids, the way to introduce them to nature and environment and wildlife and conservation is to appeal to their sense of wonder and love, and getting them to feel a connect to nature in whatever way possible. Just get them fascinated by it, have a sense of awe for it, or give them tools to be able to explore their surroundings, and for them to discover things by themselves, or to even become an animal or a bird which they're talking about. And a lot of work has shown how this really, really helps at a young age. And then as you get older, I think it's fine to start having these conversations with, so middle school students, for example, it's completely fine to start talking about some of the problems of the world or the environment, because these are topical, these are current, these are happening, and they will be exposed to it in whatever way, right? Through media and through relentless kind of articles, which they, or even in school textbooks. And so, but I think even for middle school kids, while it's important to have open, honest conversations about the state of the world, I think we should also be responsible to instill a sense of hope that we can make things a little better if, as a community, we make that change, right? And to stress that while individual actions like, okay, shunning plastic, etc., a lot of people talk about that, or try and use public transport as much as possible, are important. to not forget that we also have to do things in the larger scale, right? And not to stop at saying that, okay, if I don't use plastic at home, that means things are good, or things are, but to constantly question the system which is allowing for that to happen. But that this needs to happen for kids who are a little older, who can have that kind of conversation and debate with their peers and with their teachers, you know, and so they've been exposed to the environment in the sense of them exploring it and feeling a connect to it, then being given these kind of problems which they are now facing, and to give them the space and the ability to question or say, okay, what is it that we can do as a group of people? And again, I really have a, you know, I think some of us have been talking about this, that sense of activism. I think we're losing out as a conservation community. Somewhere along the line, which we had a very strong sense of activism, right? All of us grew up reading about the Silent Valley agitation and how that kind of spurred the whole huge conservation movement in India. That is kind of, you know, I don't know why it's petered out over the years and over the many years in our field. And then so science is important, and you know, dabbling in numbers and science and statistics is important, yes. But somewhere along the line, we have you know, pushed it to the margins by either calling it too soft or not important enough or not sciencey enough to you know, to be taken seriously. So I think for me, for older children, to just instill that sense that to be a bit more of an activist and to question the system a little bit more, which again, our education system is just killing that ability to do that. So can we, you know, push for that to happen a little bit more? So in terms of ethics, it's a bit difficult, right? All of us lead lives where we're having huge impacts on the planet, right? Whether we, you know, have our own vehicles or whether we kind of have electronic equipment which we all use, we all know that each of it takes a toll on the thing. So I think as a community, we should be able to tell ourselves that we should do what we can, question, of course, the system a little bit more, put out the messaging that anything that we do is a problem, but can we make things a little bit better? And not be too preachy about it as much as possible, because we would lose a whole the audience which we're trying to reach out to when we come across as preachy, because we are not, you know, practicing what we preach often. So it is a bit of a gray area. It's a little bit difficult to kind of, I think, articulate this very well, because we are also guilty about, you know, not living within our means often. And so to tell other people not to do it can be a bit problematic. So putting the message out there as much as we can, and then allowing people to engage with it, I think might be a bit more effective, I think.
Yeah, no, I think the fact that a lot of nature education involves instilling that curiosity, you know, and providing people with a good amount of information about their surroundings and the kind of impacts we have, rather than saying, do this, do that, this is right, this is wrong.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I feel like if I were told without any context to do something just out of rebellion, I wouldn't do it. You know?
Exactly.
And I think that also varies with age, like you said. And I think as a community, we also have a tendency to say, you know, oh, the younger generations are stewards of conservation and they are the only hope. And that's a lot of pressure to put on a kid. And you know, they shouldn't be our marketing for conservation shouldn't have so much of a doomsday cloud over it. So I think you're very right when you say we have to keep age groups in mind and also make sure we leave them with some amount of hope and optimism, apart from knowledge that there are things and conservation issues that need work. So I also, you know, what we realize is you're the first person we've interviewed who has dipped her feet in so many conservation ponds. You know, you've done the science side of things, you've done a lot of research, you've engaged with communities, you've worked in Valparai on restoration work, you've done education, you've done management, fundraising, you know, collaborations. So I guess I don't know if maybe this is something you're asked often, but what has been the most meaningful to you in all of this? And have you decided which your path is, or do you think you'd continue to keep dabbling?
Very difficult question, Ishita. But, I think I'm really happy and I think fortunate to be able to have got the opportunity to dabble in these different things. Some of it is personality. Some of it is just because I think I was also confused for large parts of my career. And I think I may be still confused, right? I'm enjoying what I do right now. And I, for the first time, see myself really engaging with nature education for a much longer period of time. Because I see the relevance of it. I see that there is a kind of a space that requires, work and intervention, um, and an opportunity to try and make a small change. So, in terms of just conservation field experience, I mean, Valparai was really really useful for me because I was in a in a place where there were forests around me, and you know. Because it was a field station, I would come across or meet people who were doing different types of ecological research work. So just to be able to have access to them, talk to them, have conversations, um, but also having the ability to have conversations with somebody like Madhusudan, right? And for me, he was a person who kind of made me think of conservation from a perspective of a more social sciences lens. Because very early on he started looking at conservation from the community perspective, and having long conversations with him really kind of opened up my mind to the way I was looking at conservation until then. Right? Again, when you are in a small geographical space, you also attract a certain type of people who you then start thinking very alike, right? Because that's the kind of conversations you have. But when I came to to Mysore and I met people doing conservation in different ways, it gives you a very different perspective, and so you're able to see a much broader, you get a much broader view of conservation. So it's very important to engage with people who also work in the conservation fields from very different perspectives, because that will then allow you to decide what you think seems to be the path forward in your area. I think often we tend to sit in a little narrow kind of myopic groups because we tend to agree and reinforce each other's ideas. But it's very useful to sometimes step out of that comfort zone, talk to people who think very differently, and engage in a debate and conversation with them. So for me, having access to somebody like a Madhu who was looking at conservation from a very different perspective really helped. And I took this knowledge with me when I went into the Cambridge course. So yeah, and so in terms of, so I wouldn't say that there's a specific kind of thing which really helped me. I think the fact that I had an opportunity to dabble in a lot of these things, and for the organization to give me the space and belief in allowing me to kind of pursue some of these interests uh, really helped kind of give me different kinds of skill sets. I don't know whether this will work for everyone, honestly. So if somebody is very clear that they want to do research in a particular field, say for example that somebody knows that elephants is something that they want to do research on, and that they're very clear that they can see themselves doing research on that particular group of animals, and they want to get into a research organization, they want to teach, and they want to be in an institutional setup. It's fine, right? That's equally valid. To a person who may say, actually, you know what, I don't think I can do one thing for 3-4 years. I need to be able to do different types of projects and help in different things. And for me, I bring in all these different types of skill sets and I can help with all these various things. Or to be able to just explore and find for yourself what seems uh, to you, what is it that's pushing yourself to really enjoy doing the work that you do. So I don't think there's a kind of a set formula for you know for for people. It really depends on your personality, the kind of experiences that you carve for yourself, as well as what a space or people or an organization allows you to be able to do. Um, and also to, in some sense, be a little bit, I think, many of us come from places of privilege, right? Where, yes, I do have to support my parents once in a while, but for me, I'm not the breadwinner of my thing. So my choice of career and the path which I take is not determined on the fact that I have to bring in a certain paycheck every month to the table. So it's a combination of things. So a lot of people, unfortunately, don't have that choice. They have to be able to work in a space or be able to bring in a certain amount of money because of the responsibility that they have towards their families or towards. So I've not had to. I didn't have that kind of additional stress initially. Yes, that it was a bit difficult, but but that wasn't a determining kind of factor for me. But for a lot of people, that is a determining factor, and we should. People should not beat themselves if they've not been able to take a particular career path in terms of how it's presented to them, right? And so as a community, we should be able to tell people that there are various ways to get into this field. People can get into admin and contribute to the field. People can be doing fundraising and contribute to the field. People can just be doing voluntary work on the side or on their weekends and take children out, but still have, like a job in an IT field. And they're also contributing to the field. And equally, people who are doing research to be able to understand a particular system or an animal group, they're also contributing to the field. So not to keep one specific way of doing conservation on a pedestal all the time, but to allow for many people to see that there are various ways in which they can contribute to the field.
Yeah, thanks, Veena. That is great. And I think we're coming to the end of our podcast. And one of the last questions that we ask all our guests is, the inspirational things that people have. And, in some sense, leaving our listeners with what motivates you and what pushes you. And I think this podcast has been remarkable recording with you, because we got an insight on so many aspects of decision making that you make before choosing what you do, right? Because be it conservation or restoration or education or research, you not only told us what you did, you told us why you did and why you didn't do it. So I think that probably gives a better inspiration for people, a more practical guide. But we also want some, interesting things to put as links as well to our podcast. So, so if I could wrap up my part of the questions, it would be, who are the people who have inspired you the most? If you can name a few people who you think have inspired you the most, if at all. And secondly, what I suspect we know the answer to this one, but what animal or plant that you like the most?
You may be surprised.
Yeah. Okay.
No.
No. Okay.
I wouldn't want to name any particular people, because really it's been different people at different points in my career. The first organization I worked with, the Center for Indian Systems, again, it was, I'm still extremely close to them and very, very, we're still in touch. But they really allowed me to kind of explore, the field a little bit more, and gave me the opportunity to be able to carve, my career. They are the ones who encouraged me to look at Pondicherry University seriously, and, introduced me to the world of spiders, really. So it's different people have kind of helped me along my career path. So I don't want to name, but the fact that I'm in an organization which is so welcoming, I think the fact, a lot of people say, okay, you're still with the NCFI, you're still working with Nature Conservation Foundation. And I say yes, because it's, for me, it's an excellent organization to be part of. It's relatively not at all kind of top heavy or hierarchical. We feel that we have an equal voice in the organization. And so, of course, while we have our disagreements in terms of how the organization is functioning and things like that, the space to be able to have those disagreements is very, very useful, right? So I would actually say that NCF and me being part of it has really helped me shape the way I look at conservation and my career path and things like that. So I have named a few other people like even Divya and Shankaraman and Madhu, have a thing, but just various conversations with people, even across different organizations, have really kind of helped me. In terms of my favorite group, I would say still, spiders and mantids. I'm getting particularly fascinated by mantids right now because there's one small road next to our office, and just short walks over a few days, and I documented at least 7 species of mantids just in that small little road next to office. And I'm like, my God, this diversity of this group also is quite fascinating. Anything actually, I'm just really fast. I mean, the insects and spiders do get my attention and love a little bit more than other groups. I'm a little partial to them. And hopefully by middle of next year, we're bringing out a flashcard guides on common insects and spiders of Bangalore City, based on the stuff which I've been documenting around. So hopefully, I'm hoping that this will become a easy to use resource for people who take educators who take other people out on nature walks and things like that, because it seemed like there was a need for an easy to use resource. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. And I think one plug that I'd urge our listeners would be to follow Veena on Twitter or on Instagram as well, because at least I'm on Twitter and I get to see these fascinating stories, some of which open up as, almost like a crime novel, like what's going to happen next. So this is the wasp that has visited the nest, and you're waiting for the next photo to be uploaded. I think Veena tweets at Veena Da Venu, right? VENADAVENU. So yeah, please go ahead and follow and get updates on both Veena's work and these interesting stories. So yeah, that's it for me. So Ishika.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we would also like to know if there are any books in particular or any places in particular that you hold close to heart and draw inspiration from.
In terms of books, I try not to read too much wildlife books because I feel like that's my work and I want to read other things. But some of the books which I read early on in my career, especially when I was in Valpara, is about some of the more the women primatologists who have documented a lot of their work. So Birut Kaldigas's work and Diane Fossey and things like that. And early on, I think when I was in school and undergrad, my grandfather used to bring a lot of BBC wildlife, magazines from one of his friends when he saw that I really loved animals. And really that was my introduction to the animal world because there was no one in my family who, was engaged with nature or, outdoors or wildlife. And so for me, my introduction into wildlife and the animal world was just through those BBC wildlife books. But so for a long time, wildlife and animals and things like that were out there. It was always in a foreign land, right? And there was no one to kind of tell me that this is a viable career option. I just knew that I was fascinated by them because I would spend hours just looking at the pictures and reading about it. So I would say just, getting hold of books which will introduce you to to your surroundings is really useful and important. And even though today we have so much of technology in our hands where we can immediately identify an insect or a butterfly or a bird, to remind yourselves to push yourself a little bit more that, it's not just the identification, but why is it that this particular group is in this group of insects, for example? What is it that's unique about it? Why is a stick mantis called a stick mantis? Okay, and are there other things which look like it? Typically, where is it found? And so I think, so while these, these tools like iNaturalist and, stuff are useful to get people to ID what they are looking at, I'm just urging your listeners to also push themselves a little bit more to discover more about these organisms and not just stop by identification. So I've been fortunate to have things visit me during lockdown. Again, because a combination of this, having this lovely tree in front of my house, as well as just these pots, and the windows and doors are always open in my house. So these things keep coming. And for some strange reason, I've had the potter was coming. And so I could see the whole, it starting to build its pot and how it brought a caterpillar, pushed it in. So to tell yourselves that you don't need to go far away in order to have these nature experiences. A lot of drama might be just happening around you. You can just observe a little bit and you'll start having a new world open up in front of you. So I would just say that books which introduce you to the local ecology and environment are good. There are lovely kind of books, of course, which introduce you to the world of insects, animals, and plants and things. So as much as possible, familiarize yourself, read through it, and write about your experiences, write about what you're coming across, and encourage, if you have young kids, who you interact with, or your own kids, encourage them to creatively engage with the subject, in the form of a poem, or ask them to recite something, or have a small play around it. And a lot of those tools are very effective as well. So yeah, so I also I don't watch documentaries as much, because again I think that it's like you were saying in the beginning of the podcast. I think it romanticizes things a little bit too much, and so people have this image of what wildlife conservation is, and so I don't watch as much documentaries, but I can see how fascinating it is for people to get introduced into the world of natural history and different life forms. But because of these documentaries, which are aired in Discovery and National Geographic, we're also finding that kids know so much more about African wildlife, more than they know about what we find in our own backyard. And they will, sometimes argue with you. Like a lot of kids come and tell me, "No, Akka, we do not get the tarantula in India." And I'll be telling them, "But I've seen tarantulas in India. In fact, even in Bangalore, you'll get tarantulas." "No, Akka, you only find them in South America and in Africa." For some reason, no. So they say Australia and South America for tarantulas. And so you have to push back and say, "No, you get tarantulas in India as well." So it's still an alien concept that you can have such fascinating, wildlife in our own country, because people are still exposed to documentaries, which have a very Western perspective in some sense. Again, that's changing slowly, but I think we have to push for much more change.
I think I think you've taught us a very important thing, which is, regardless, even though you've had your own personal people and places and species inspiring you, I think if we tune into that world around us, it's very easy to just keep inspired every day. Like if you just see all of this happening, you really don't need too much external influence to keep you going and wanting to know more. And I think that's just so great.
But then some people have done research which have spoken to people who have been in the conservation field, or who have in the ecology field, and they have very often, people say that they've got into this field because as a child somebody, like their parent or somebody influential, took them to a forest, to a wild space, which they call. Again, these are studies which have been done in the West. Mm-hmm. So, but people say that for them it was a very influencing kind of decision in terms of, or at least getting them connected to the natural world. The fact that there was an older person or a parent to take them outdoors, and this is some of the information we're trying to gather from some of our kids as well, to see what is it that, or even to ask our own community people, what is it that has influenced you to get into this field?
Yeah. So thanks, Veena. I think we have so much that we've learned through this podcast. Yeah. And I think you've also given our listeners a lot of food for thought, just knowing so much about the field and the different aspects in which we can contribute to it. And I think it's going to do us a world of good putting this podcast out there as well. So thank you so much for taking this much time to tell us in detail about your entire journey and what it's been like for you.
Thank you, Ashika and Akshay. I mean, it was really fun talking to the two of you, and I hope I didn't drone on too much, but yeah. And
No. Thanks, Vena. Yeah, I must say that for someone who's coming from a slightly different approach to nature, I mean, because besides looking at nature as numbers and as observations of data, I find it otherwise it's just very personal. So the fact that you're bringing that personal to sharing that personal with other people, which is what a lot of what you described is just. It's very inspiring and humbling. Maybe some part of my life and our lives we can do that too. But yeah, thank you.
thank you so much. Thanks.
We had a great time recording this episode, and we hope you enjoyed it too. Thank you for listening.